And we're on the air. Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Codementor Office Hours. My name is Mark. If this is your first time joining us, basically what we do on these is get together with technologists that we're big fans of that are working on maybe a framework or a new project that we want to get a better understanding of. And what we've been focused on the past couple months actually is a big push on JavaScript, and we're going to kind of continue that theme today with our guest. In terms of protocol, our guest is going to give us a presentation, but if you have any questions, if you're jumping into the live room with us, which I see we have a couple people, you're welcome to use group chat to throw in questions, and then if you're watching the Google Plus broadcast, there's a Q&A app, and I'll get notifications about that. So without further ado, we have today Brenda Jin, and she's a web developer who specializes in tablet prototyping over at Macy's.com. She's the lead technologist on a pilot agile team whose goal is to discover best practices and e-commerce opportunities for tablets. She's given talks on Backbone.js, mobile web, interaction design all over the world. In addition, she's won hackathons for projects ranging from the Internet of Things to native mobile applications. And today, she's going to focus for us sort of on a breakdown of how to approach Jasmine testing for Backbone.js Models and Views, how Jasmine testing works with instantiating new models and views, and how to trigger and test custom events in their callbacks. So she'll go into all of that. And without further ado, please welcome Brenda.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen here, and then, is that working? Then we can get started. Okay, great. So I wanted to start with a brief presentation before we go to the Q&A. And this one is a slide deck on Jasmine testing Backbone.js Models and Views. If you want to follow along with the slide deck, you can go to this link, jasmine-backbone.herokuapp.com. I'm also on Twitter at cyberneticlove if you want to stay in touch. Also, there's some files you might want to check out on the GitHub repository to see these examples, and they're actually here. So if you look for Jasmine Backbone under Brenda Jin, you should be able to find everything all set up together. Great. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of testing, specifically with Jasmine, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about testing Backbone models, and then I'll talk about testing Backbone views. So I wanted to begin with this question about why testing is important. And the answer is that code is for humans. We often are collaborating at work with other human beings, and it's other human beings who recognize expectation and bugs. There wouldn't be bugs without broken expectations. The computer just does exactly what you tell it to, and maybe there's an error, maybe there isn't, but only humans can determine whether something is right or wrong. So testing helps us to set expectations. It's also a technique that helps us think through the different steps of what is supposed to happen, either on the application or for the user. And the user can be the person who's interacting with your product, or it could be somebody that you're coding with. Testing also helps us break down the different pieces of what we're building, and that's necessary in order to be able to test. And it's also great for readability and maintainability. And then it also makes upgrades and deprecations easier because pieces are more plug and play when we build them that way. So in this example, I'm going to use Jasmine. It's a great tool to use. And it's got some things that make it very readable. So suites and specs are written with strings in plain English, and they describe exactly what's going on to the human user. And these are especially easy to read once the tests run in the browser. So a describe block will be for a suite, and then the it and expect blocks will be for individual specs. And I'll show you how that's done. So in the top here, in your spec file, you might describe a suite, test for a custom Backbone model. So all of your tests for might be inside of that suite. Scope works exactly like it does in JavaScript. So here I have a local variable, Macy's, that's going to be available throughout the rest of my specs. And then my first spec, it can have a custom method called calculate age. So inside of there, I instantiate a new store model, and then I expect a method to be defined. And then this, if we look in the source file, store model will have been defined as a backbone model somewhere else with the method calculate age. And if it's not, then the spec will fail. So a great tool that we have to help us in Jasmine is the before each and after each block. When we're writing a test, there's three basic parts. And I like to think of it as an act, or if you were to see or produce you know, a show or a musical or something staged. So the first step is to set the stage. You need to make sure your props are ready to go. You need to make sure that the context and lighting are correct. All the players are ready to go wherever they're supposed to be. And that's the same for testing. So you want to make sure that every tool that you need, every library that you need is available. Everything that you were supposed to instantiate or not instantiate is ready to go. All the settings that you were supposed to configure for this particular test are ready. And then on stage, you would let the players play their parts. So then this would be the spec executing. And then finally at the end, you don't just walk away, you'll have to clean things up. So maybe you'll have to unbind some events or delete things or reset, and that's the tear down the stage part. And when we have a big suite of specs that repeatedly do the same tasks for setup and teardown, we can use before each and after each to execute before and after each spec to consistently set and tear down the stage the same way. So here's an example for this suite. It's, again, test for a custom backbone model, and we're actually using a before each block. And inside of it, we're going to instantiate a new store model, and every time we have a spec, we're going to have access to the same store model. So it doesn't matter if one spec before is going to change a whole ton of things about the model and then test those changes. Every time we hit a spec, it's going to be a fresh model. And that way, we don't have to manually set up and undo this every time we write a test. There's some files that you might want to download. I created this link here if you want to follow along. I'm going to skip the live coding part and just talk through the examples, but if you want to try them, you can totally download the files on your own and take a peek. So here's the sample spec for testing models, which you can take a look at, and we'll also step through each one of these on their own in the next couple of slides. So when it comes to testing, I don't think it's very useful to test just for testing's sake. I see a lot of testing that's just configurations and key value pairs and whether things exist. And while that will actually boost your test coverage for certain measurement tools, it's not the most useful thing when you're writing tests like that for your coworkers, and it doesn't necessarily accomplish the goals that we talked about before of modularity, ease of upgrading and deprecating, and necessarily breaking things down. So the steps that I take when I'm going to write tests are these building blocks. So I do test setup and instantiation and defaults and methods in the beginning. That's troubleshooting 101, do these things exist, are they ready to go? But then I'll take it a step further. I'll test the initialization process with some spies. I will also test control flow and logic branching with spies. And then the last part, which is pretty tricky, is testing events and their callbacks. So first of all, we want to set up and instantiate. We want to define a variable and a scope that makes sense for the specs, and then either instantiate per test or in a before each block. I really like to make sure that the expectations are consistent for each spec and that each model is set up the same way so that they're readable. So in this case, I instantiated a new store model in the before each statement, and I stored it in Macy's. And there's just some basic attributes here: brand name, website, year founded, and then a Boolean for is department store. And now I'm just going to do a really quick test for the defaults that I expect to exist. First of all, I expect there to be defaults, and then a brand name, website, year founded, and is department store. I could even test these defaults without having set them previously on Macy's, and that would be really useful too, because if I were to make a model without them, I should expect them to exist a certain way. And then when you're setting defaults, a great thing to think about is, how do I want this eventually to be rendered? How is the default property going to work with whatever templating engine that I'm using? So now I'll check methods. Before we checked this calculate age method, maybe it will set the age after calculate age is called. So I want to make sure not only does it exist, does it do the right thing? So here I'm going to call calculate age, then I'll expect a new property age to be defined, and then I'll expect it to equal a new date with a full year minus whatever year that the store, or Macy's in this case, was founded. The next step is to test the initialization process, because I want these models to initialize consistently, and I want to make sure that the right steps are taken as they're kicked off. And I'm going to use a spy. So in this case, I'm going to spy on the method calculate age. I'm going to call initialize on Macy's, and then I will expect calculate age to have been called. This is the same technique we can use for control flow, so you can also use spies for different sets of logic. In this case, I'm going to spy on the method fetch departments. And remember, in our defaults, that is department store, well, actually not in the defaults, but when we set the model, is department store was set to true. So in that case, when we initialize, we expect Macy's.fetchDepartments to have been called, because it is a department store. Then we can go ahead and set is department store to false, call initialize again, and then only expect fetch departments to have been called once. This is something that you could have broken out into two separate specs as well, and that might have been easier to read, kind of broken down, but you can use the calls count or to have been called methods to test whether and how many times these methods have been called. So in this case, I expected it to just have been called once. And finally, events and callbacks, which is the trickiest part. I want to make sure that customer built-in events are triggered correctly, and I'll use spies as the event listeners. So here I made a fake object with a fake callback, and I actually want to spy on the fake callback. And then I want to be able to, on a certain custom event, call this fake callback. So then I'll trigger a custom event and expect the fake callback to have been called. This step becomes more important when you put the models and views together and you want to test an event that was triggered in a certain case on the model that the view should have reacted to. So now I want to talk about testing views, and again you can take a look at this sample spec, and we will be stepping through each of these on their own. So the building blocks that I think of for views are very similar, but with a couple more extras. So a lot of the stuff that we already talked about with models, and then going a little bit further for testing DOM events and their callbacks, interaction with a model or collection, functional DOM changes, and these are not necessarily layout changes. They're more related to if the model has this many elements, how many LI elements do I expect to exist in the template? Or what are the basic functional changes of the DOM, excluding styling, that I should expect to happen in certain cases? So we can set up an instantiate very similarly to our model, except that in addition to the view, we'll also need this model. So first we'll do the model, and then the view with the model that we created before. Then we can test for DOM events and their callback. So we can look at the events object and check that this clickUL li event is is defined in the object, and then we'll expect the callback to be this string. So this is just how you set up the basic events object. And this is not necessarily the most interesting part of the testing, but still part of that. Are things set up the way I expect, and is everything ready to go? The more interesting part is what we're going to talk about next, which is testing the functionality of each callback. So we can test interaction with the data and its reaction, the view's reaction to changes, and we'll do that with a spy. In this case, we'll need to spy on the prototype, and this step really depends on how you set up your scope and how you instantiate your views and models. But you will want to make sure that you're spying on the right method. In this case, we're spying on render. And we also want to call through, because maybe there's some other things that we'll want to test after that. So we'll be able to test for reactions to model level events. Maybe we want to call render every time that the model is changed. So you'll remember that we instantiated the model in the before each block. And now inside of the spec, we're going to set is department store to false. So that should be a change on the model. And we'll expect render to have been called at that time. We might also check for functional DOM changes. And this is the more complicated part, but I find that it's very useful for things such as whenever you have to render a board of things like pinned images or Rolodex, to-do list. If you're traversing a menu that has multiple layers, this part becomes particularly useful. So if we step through it, I'm actually checking the length of the number of children of a node here. So I'm going to compare the old length and the new length. I'm going to render the view and append that element to the body, which exists in the spec runner for the tests in HTML. I'll calculate the length, so the number of li elements that were rendered under the view. Then I'll use jQuery to trigger a click, and I'll expect there to be a new length. So maybe this is in reaction to rendering a whole nother set of children under this, like in a nested menu. And then I'll maybe expect the difference to equal 1. So the length is changing depending on where you click in the list here. Or maybe you're adding elements every time you're clicking. And then at the end, I'll want to clean everything up at the end of the test. So that concludes the presentation part, and now would be a good time to open the floor up for questions.
Great, thanks. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please jump in to the group chat or the Q&A app. I can kick things off with some that were emailed in before. So one of the common questions we were getting is, relative to other testing frameworks, what are the primary advantages you see to Jasmine as a good testing framework with Backbone?
Oh, well, it's just a tool, so you really need to pick what works for you and your application. There are some restrictions with the runners. So do you need a specific type of runner to work with your continuous integration? Because you might have to pick one based on version compatibility, or if you're using Jenkins, maybe only certain things are compatible. If you're using Circle CI, maybe only certain versions are compatible. So you really need to use what works best for you and your development workflow.
Gotcha.
I really like that Jasmine runs both in the browser, and then there's other runners for it that work with the continuous integration. The browser part especially, because I can trigger custom events, and I can use the dev tools that I like to use all the time, like with the debugger, and I can load jQuery and use jQuery to manipulate the DOM and test those changes. That's pretty cool. But there are other testing suites that you'd also be able to do that with.
Gotcha. What are your favorite resources for Jasmine and Backbone, just for continued learning?
I really like to try things out on my own and see what works, see what breaks. dig deep and inspect things. And then when I have a question, I'll usually just turn to the internet and ask Google.
Fair enough. Do you know of any other major companies or projects that are utilizing Jasmine in a similar way that you are?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm sure a lot of companies. It's a very common setup. When I was at Backbone Conf last year, it seemed like almost all of the people that I'd talked to were familiar with testing Backbone with Jasmine.
Gotcha. It's getting pretty popular. Well, yeah, and anyone else feel free to jump in with some questions. I think people are a little shy today. If you are you able to show us any live coding examples?
Yeah, we can actually step through those. Let me set up my screen here.
No problem. And if I didn't mention at the beginning for everyone tuning in from the other room, this is all going to be live on the Codementor YouTube channel as soon as we stop. So any examples that Brenda's showing us, you can feel free to go back and review. I know sometimes people are frantic taking notes, but this is all being recorded.
Oh, yeah. And everything's on the GitHub repo, so that should be good. Okay, so let's share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, great. Actually, I will also want to run this in, let me share it a different way because I'll also want to run this in the browser, so I'll need to just pick sharing my entire screen. Okay, great. So, just trying to find, oh, it's an example. Okay, I actually meant to open that with Chrome. So let's try that again. So under public, example, spec runner. Oh gosh, okay. This is a new computer, so I'm having a little bit of trouble with the new,
no problem.
The new MacBook mouse. Okay, so here, this is all the tests running in the browser, and you'll see they're all failing. And that's how it's going to be set up when you download the repo. So let's go ahead and take a look actually at the directories. This is the application for both the slides and the example. So where you'll want to look is under public, and then here under example. And then you'll see that I have created the source for the app, and then the app solution, which is not wired up, and then the two specs for model spec and view spec. So I'm going to open up app right here, which will be empty, and it's why all the tests are failing. And then over here, let's start with the models. So we can just do some of this live. So test for a custom backbone model. Before each, we'll instantiate a new store model. So basically, we'll need to make sure that we actually have a store model first. An app is being loaded on spec runner before the test. So you can see that all in spec runner .html, all the libraries that I need, jQuery_backbone, and all the Jasmine libraries that I'll need are loaded before, and then I have my app, and then after that I'll have the model spec and view spec. So that's how everything's loading. You might have a build system that puts that all together for you. So here we'll just create a store model. And we'll set some defaults because we'll expect, we'll have brand name. Let's see, right here, I'm just following along here with the tests. There's a website. There's a year founded. Let's make that 2015. There's an is department store, and that was set to true. Okay, so now let's run these tests again. And we'll see something failing. We'll take a look at the console. Cannot read property extent, maybe because I should have capitalized this. Great, so we have our first test passing, and then a little bit of kind of a look into how I would debug. So I went and I looked at the errors. Otherwise, I would read the errors over here. And we can click on spec list to see all of them. So we now have our default properties such as brand name, website, year founded, and is department store. And we can move on to the next test. Can have a custom method called calculate age. So for all of this, you might not necessarily write all of the tests at once. You might write 3 to 5 tests and then go back to the code and then write a couple more tests and then go back to the code, or maybe you're the type of person that wants to write a little bit of code and then a little bit of tests. As long as you're not writing hundreds and hundreds of lines of the code before writing the tests, you'll probably be in good shape for the testing. So we'll go on to, can have a custom method called calculate age. And we'll just make sure that calculate age is defined here. And it's supposed to get the age and then set it. So let's see. Once it's called, we'll do this dot set age to new date dot get full year. Minus this dot get year founded. And hopefully, when we call this function, it'll set age. So let's check that out. Cool, and it worked. And not only does calculate age exist, it sets the age properly when it's called. So the next one is make sure that calculate age is called when instantiated, and this is the one that we did with the spy. So if we go over here and take a look, we're spying on the method calculate age, and we expect it to be called when initialize is called. So let's go ahead and define initialize right here, and we'll call calculate age. So hopefully this test will now pass, and it does. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, we have a couple questions that have come in, actually. Okay. Someone was curious about the difference between Jasmine and Selenium.
So I believe people use Selenium more for integration tests. It's a different type of testing than Jasmine. Jasmine is under the category of behavior-driven tests, and they're really functional, so they're very close to the JavaScript that you're going to be writing for your application, whether it's client-side or whether it's for Node.js. In terms of performance, you might be able to write some custom functions that kind of test timing, but there's probably better tools for testing the overall performance of your application.
Great.
Jasmine gets pretty close to the methods and the control flow and the very small pieces of the JavaScript that you're writing.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions we have right now. If you want to show any other aspects of the live code, that would be great.
Okay. How about I show maybe some debugging?
Cool. Yeah.
Because that's a pretty important step of all of this. So if something goes wrong, right? So let's pretend I calculate age was called incorrectly. So if we go back to our test here, we'll see that something's failed. Cool. And everything seems to be failing, which is odd because things were passing before. So we can go to our sources and we can take a look at our application and maybe step through some things. And here I can, I've set a breakpoint, so I can actually stop at this point and take a look at the scope here under scope variables. And let's go ahead and look at here under proto, and we'll see that I put calculate age this way here. Calculate age is actually spelled with a capital A. So if I want to just actually test it without changing my code, I can fix it here and hit save and then run everything. I can uncheck this breakpoint but keep it there so that it doesn't hit all the next times. And you'll see that the tests are now passing. So this way, either with stepping through or stepping into or out of or over, I can get a very good look at the order of how things are executing, the scope at the time that they're executing, and the different pieces of the control flow and how everything is fitting together. So we can actually do that again. I'm going to fix that, but let's look at calculate age. So what's cool here is that you can actually step into this. So let's step in. And we'll see here we stepped into the backbone get method. That's pretty cool. Let's step out of that. I think we can step in again. And this time we're actually stepping into the set method. And we would actually be able to go through this whole method and check out what's happening at every step of the way. But I'm actually going to, I'm just going to show you stepping a couple times. So maybe I'll step, and maybe I want to see what key actually is. So here it's age, and I can see that by hovering. I can see if any of these other variables are defined yet, but I can also see them in the scope variables down here. And I can keep stepping through, or I can step out and keep going. So if there's no more questions,
one more just came in actually. Yeah, can Jasmine be used like Travis CI, which announces status of GitHub repos?
Well, you would use Jasmine with Travis CI as part of your build process. So you would configure the build to run all your Jasmine tests and point it at the right directories. And then if all the tests pass, then everything will get merged. So that's how I use it at work. We have a tool that will put together the whole spec runner and then serve it on a port, so I can actually do this type of testing in the browser. But then when I want to check in my code, it goes up to Jenkins, all the tests from everybody run, and only when all the tests pass with the runner, and I think we use a combination of Phantom and Karma. When all the tests pass, that's when the code gets merged in. So if there's a failure, my code won't get merged.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, was there any more on the debugging you want to show, or was that a good example, you think?
I think that's a good light example. There's so little going on in these very light methods that it's hard to show you more complicated parts. The parts that are great are really when you're getting into more complicated control flow and if statements, because you can see which statement you're hitting, whether there's a local variable that was supposed to be defined that isn't. The scope inspection is really useful.
Great. Yeah, if there are any other questions, please now's the time to send them in. Otherwise, Brenda, where should people? Are you doing any blogging about your Jasmine testing work, or should people just check you out on Twitter?
I think people just ping me on Twitter, also on GitHub as Brenda Jin, and you can check out this repository. I also have a require, and I'm a big contributor to the teachingmaterials.org site, which is the curriculum that we use at Girl Develop It, San Francisco. So I'll just show you that really quick. And this is a lot of our curricula from beginning of HTML and CSS all the way through to Backbone and Angular. And if you take a look at the Backbone materials and you go through the exercises, a lot of these are also written with Jasmine. So let me actually show you one of these, because that's been pretty useful for our students. So if you go to exercises, you'll download this file, and we'll unzip it. And then we'll open specrunner.html. Gosh, there goes my mouse again. Oh gosh. Okay. It's got that new double-click thing. So in the Backbone class that Girl Develop at San Francisco teaches, we use this big suite. And at the end of the class, students should have every test passing. So they'll start at the beginning with a global variable, and then they'll go on to follow these instructions for creating a Backbone model with defaults and custom methods.
Sweet. If you send me a link to that, I'll include that I'll send an email to everyone who RSVP'd.
Okay.
We had about 70 people RSVP to this, and with links to all of your content and the link to this recording. But if there aren't any other questions, I don't want to take too much more of your time, Brenda. But thank you so much for sharing this with us, and this recording will definitely help a lot of people.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and check out more Codementor office hours, and obviously if you have any testing projects you're having any issues with, Codementor is always at your disposal, and I'll send these links and all these examples in a follow-up email shortly. Thanks so much.